The familiar metallic taste of blood and dirt mingled in Edward's mouth as he hit the ground. He winced in pain, then spat the distasteful mixture and wiped his lips. Naman had been a little too rough with him this time. For an older man, his trainer could still fight better than most soldiers. Edward brushed the dust from his arms and knees as he rose, pulling a twig out of his curly brown hair. He tucked his dragon-tooth necklace into his shirt and took a step forward, his body aching beneath tattered clothes. Gazing down, he noticed a speck of blood dotting the material above his left knee. "Hurry up, lad! Let's get on with it!" Naman yelled, swinging his wooden sword in a figure-8 pattern, as if trying to loosen his arm. Edward peered around for his own practice sword and picked it up, dragging the tip on the soft dirt, leaving a wavy line behind it. He gripped the wooden hilt tighter, lifting his weapon up in front of him, his lips curling upward. "What are you grinning at, boy?" Naman barked. "I almost had you that last time." Naman's lips tightened. "Almost? If I were a Varnak, you'd be dead." Edward nodded, preparing to attack, but then hesitated. It would be dark soon. "I think I'm done for today." Naman scrunched his eyebrows. "You're done when I say you're done." "I need to get to work," Edward protested. "Bron will have me fired if I'm late again." "Pfft, Bron." Naman spat out the words. "Why you insist on going back to that fat tavern owner, I'll never know. Just quit and head south already." "You know I can't." "You can. You just choose not to." Naman sighed and tossed his sword under a tree. "Come inside before you go. I have something to give you." He strode toward the house without waiting for a response, his muscular arms swinging with each step. Edward glanced at the sky. The setting sun bathed the clouds above the horizon in a golden-orange color, like bright sand trickling through an hourglass, counting down the minutes before he had to be at work. He took a deep breath and watched Naman enter his small home, which was surrounded by tall trees. A gust of wind blew through the clearing in the forest where Naman and Edward trained daily. Edward wiped the sweat from his brow and realized the state of his clothes. Bron would skin him alive if he turned up to the tavern wearing that filth. He needed to change. He hurried toward the house, hoping Naman would not take too long. His knee complained with each stride, distorting his motion with a slight hop. The wooden door protested with a squeak as he opened it to find Naman inside the dim room. A subtle, musty odor filled Edward's nostrils. Despite the number of times he had come here to train, he had never been inside the house. They had always trained outside, and the times they spent talking was usually on the front porch. He inspected the room. It was void of any personal touch. A small table with a single wooden chair as well as a bed in the corner, and a cupboard made up his entire collection of furniture. Naman's strange philosophy of living a simple life, when he could obviously afford better, had never made sense to Edward. "Here," Naman said, handing him a folded piece of paper. Edward unfolded it and glanced at the peculiar symbols written on it. "What is this?" Edward asked, tilting his head as he tried to decipher the strange text. Naman glared at Edward. "Can't you read, boy?" "No, I never learned." Edward shrugged as if it were no big deal. "Thank the Creator you can fight then," Naman chuckled, the wrinkles around his eyes forming odd shapes. He placed a candle on the table and lit it, his silver hair reflecting the flickering light. "It's a letter of recommendation. It has my seal. At the very least, the keepers will give you a tryout, if you ever get to Aramar." Edward stared at the letter. This piece of paper had now become one of his most cherished belongings. "Thank you. It means a lot, even though—" "Don't worry. Things will work out, you'll see." Edward glanced at the letter, then sighed. If only it were possible. No, Regardless of how much he wanted to, he could not leave Cadestone, despite what Naman thought. Not yet. "Anyway, off with you now." Naman smacked Edward on the back harder than most men would, freeing him from his trance and ushered him outside. Edward carefully folded the letter, placed it in his pocket, and hurried to his house. His mother had been away for 2 days. Hopefully he still had clean clothes left. Edward's knee ached with each step, but he pushed through. A wave of relief washed away the edge of his anxiety when he found clothes neatly folded in his cupboard. Edward took the letter out of his pocket and placed it on a side table. He quickly threw off his clothes and put on the clean ones. Bursting back out of the house, he headed for the town centre, ignoring any objections from his knee. Edward glanced at the horizon, wishing that he could somehow make the sun stand still. He was going to be late. He tried to move faster but found it only irritated his knee more, and he cursed at his bad fortune. He hoped Bron was in a good mood. He had had enough of Bron and his attitude. Unable to run any longer, he settled for a walk. If only he did not need the money. As he traversed the dusty pathway through golden fields littered by random trees, he wondered if he would ever make use of the letter Naman had given him. He reached into his shirt, pulling out his necklace. Another gift from Naman. A dragon tooth hanging from a blue string. He allowed his fingers to brush against the strange blue engraved symbol, thankful for how much Naman had blessed him in recent years. He remembered how thrilled he had been over 4 years ago when he found out a keeper had come to Cadestone to retire. A laugh escaped his mouth at the memory of how persistent he had been with Naman. He had stood outside his house every day, insisting that he train him until the seasoned warrior could take it no more. His mother had hated the idea, but Edward was far too stubborn to be deterred. Naman had been like a father to him ever since. Not a day went by when Edward did not imagine what it would be like to face the vile beasts that Naman had fought against. He had spent countless days listening to his stories about battles against horrid monsters such as Varnak and Tyrids. They had even invited Naman to the Isle of Tanzilon as part of a diplomatic mission on the king's behalf. What he would not give to see the island known to most as the nest of the dragons. Edward smiled at the thought. Naman thought he was good enough, that he could join the keepers, yet he kicked a stone, sending it dancing toward a tree. He stared down at his worn-out shoes. What if he failed? Then what would he have? Maybe people were right. Maybe he never would amount to anything. Besides, he could never leave his mother. He sighed as the tavern came into view, snatching him back from his daydream and grounding him firmly in reality. June thought about her dream as she approached the new town. She had told no one of it, because no one would understand. She recalled how real it had felt, her standing in the darkness, and the light speaking in the darkness, telling her to head south. It had taken her a few days to work up the courage, but eventually she had given in to the strong urge to follow the dream's instructions. She shook her head and focused on the present. It would be dark soon. She glanced up at the new town and stopped for a moment, taking in the sight. She bit her lip, taking deep breaths, her feet rooted to the ground. She could do this. At least, she would try. The small town, though larger than her own village, reminded her of the stories her grandmother used to tell her. An old, worn-out sign with the name Cadestone lay abandoned on the side of the road. Several small stores provided for the most basic needs of the people, who hurriedly went about their business, trying to get things done before it got dark. Most of the houses were slightly larger and seemed sturdier than the ones June was accustomed to. On her right, a couple of horses stood tied up outside of a small tavern, which, though a little worn down, seemed cozy enough. She squinted as she read the faded letters, Bronze Tavern, above the door. Her stomach rumbled at the thought of food. She had not had anything to eat since breakfast. She dug into her pocket, feeling the impoverished money bag. A reminder that she could not afford this journey. The tavern was her best chance at a hot meal. Outside the tavern sat two elderly men smoking a pipe in silence. They seemed content sitting there, staring out at the horizon. Uneasiness stirred inside June as she considered walking up to the establishment. Be brave, she reminded herself, then took a step forward. She allowed the momentum of that first step to carry her toward the tavern. The two old men gazed at her and grinned. She smiled back and nodded awkwardly. Their smiles grew wider, exposing crooked teeth as they gazed at her from top to bottom. She looked away, blushing with embarrassment, and entered the tavern without a word. 15 small wooden tables filled the tavern, though more dominant than anything else was a strong, musky smell. An array of paintings decorated the walls, each one completely different from the next. Numerous voices lent themselves to the dizzying buzz that saturated the air. Men drinking or singing off-tone occupied half of the tables. In one corner, a large man sat at a table, making broad hand gestures while he described at the top of his voice an encounter he had recently had with a dragon. Opposite June stood a bar and, behind it, a young man about 18 years of age, with brown curly hair and handsome features. A small scar crossed his left eyebrow. Seeing someone so close to her own age was encouraging. Perhaps this meant there was a chance of her getting hired. She said a quick prayer in her heart, took a deep breath, and walked toward him. "Hi," she said, lifting her hand halfway to shake his, then dropped it back down. The man smiled warmly, unlike the old men outside. "Hi, what can I do for you?" he asked. His casual manner lightened the burden on her chest, making it easier for her to speak. "My name is June. I need a place to stay. I can work to pay it off." She did her best to keep her voice from shaking, looking him straight in the eyes. His smile faded, replaced by a thin line. "Are you sure?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "Yes, of course." The man took on a more formal attitude. "Okay, the owner is the man sitting in the corner over there." He tilted his head to the right. "The big one with the moustache. You need to speak to him. His name is Bron." June turned and glanced at who the bartender had indicated. The portly man's stomach spilled over his belt, pushing against the table. Food stains covered his white shirt, and a large black moustache hid his upper lip. As she approached him, the man smiled a joyful smile. He shushed the people at the table and sat up straight as if to say, "I have important business to attend to." "Mr. Bron?" she asked.
No, my child,"
he said.
"Just Bron."
He had a strange accent and spoke as if he wanted the entire room to hear. "Mr. Bron, I need a place to stay tonight. I'm willing to work to pay my way." She hoped he had not heard the tremble in her voice.
"There you go again, calling me mister."
The man eyed her from top to bottom.
"Well, you need some cleaning up, but the Creator has blessed you with good looks. People will pay good money for a pretty girl like you."
She thought it was ironic that a man with a shirt full of food stains said she needed cleaning up. The truth was, it had been a long day on a dusty road, and she could use some freshening up.
"I expect tonight to be a busy night," he continued. "I'm sure we could use an extra girl, as long as you don't mind the snoring."
He burst out in laughter at his own joke and slapped the backs of the men next to him, encouraging them to laugh. June replayed the strange joke in her mind, trying to figure out what he meant. Bron must have read her expression and explained.
"Some of our customers like to fall asleep with the ladies afterward. They pay extra money for it,"
he said, and winked at her. June's eyes grew wide as she realized what kind of establishment she had walked into. She had heard of such places, but had not recognized this as one. She found herself lost for words, moisture abandoning her lips. "I'm sorry to waste your time," she finally said, with a shaky voice, as respectfully as she could. She turned around with her head down and stepped toward the door, quickening her pace, eager to escape her embarrassment. The journey out lingered, refusing her the small comfort of evading the gaze of the people in the tavern. Her cheeks reddened as she stole a glance at the bar where the young man stood. His previous reaction now made sense. What did he think of her now? Bron's voice resonated in the room, offering her more money and asking the men around him if he had said something wrong. She exited the door, reminding herself not to look at the two old men outside, but their stares still seemed to permeate through her back. She hurried down the street and turned the corner, placing her back to the wall as she took deep breaths. A single tear fell down her cheek, and in a defeated voice she uttered, "Creator, help me." Edward smiled in amusement at what had just happened. Bron's confused face was priceless. Edward wanted to laugh at the situation, but at the same time something burned inside of him. This young woman was not like any he had ever met. She was odd but intriguing. There was a mystery about her that gripped his heart and pulled in a way that made it hard to think of anything else. A hand smacked down on the bar in front of him, almost knocking over a few glasses, startling Edward, who had not noticed Bron move from his corner toward him.
"I'm not paying you to sit around and daydream,"
Bron yelled.
"Worthless worm."
Edward picked up the half-empty glasses and took them into the kitchen to be washed. He hated working here. Admiration for June rose inside of him for turning down the job. Edward's mother had begged him not to work here, but what choice did he have? It was this or starve. Edward walked back out to the bar, his mind once again gravitating toward June. Would he ever see her again? He hoped so. As he approached the bar, two drunk men yelled complaints about his brief absence. Bron gave Edward a dirty look from his corner table, which Edward seemed to receive several times a day. One of the drunk men looked at him, barely opening his eyes. "2 more pints of beer," he said with a slur so bad Edward could just about understand what he was saying. The man's long brown hair hung like a rag in front of his face, which he attempted to move by blowing. "I think you two have had enough," Edward said calmly, then forced a smile. "Who are you to tell us we've had enough? Do you hear that, Bron? He's turning away customers," yelled the other drunkard, who was in slightly better condition than his friend. Bron stood, fuming, his face a bright red tint that Edward had not seen before. He whacked his chair out of the way so hard that it flew across the room, then stomped toward Edward.
"I've had enough of you! Get out!"
he yelled. Edward sighed, stepping out from behind the bar and heading for the door. Great. This was the second job he had lost in a month. A sharp tug on the back of his shirt pulled him back. As Edward turned, a fist met his face, sending him toppling over a table. Glasses shattered, filling the area with razor-sharp diamonds.
"When I'm done with you, you will never want to step foot in here again."
Another one of Bron's large fists struck him in the ribs. Edward kicked him back, rolling to his feet. Bron tried to land another punch. Edward dodged, using Bron's momentum to send him spinning, knocking him into the bar. Another man grabbed Edward from behind. Edward twisted, throwing him over his shoulder. Another fist hit his face, and yet another as two more men joined the fight. Before he could get his bearings, Bron grabbed him, pulled him outside the door, and threw him onto the dusty road.
"I hope you and your mother starve,"
Bron called, as he strode back inside. Edward lay on the ground, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His body throbbed, protesting with aches and pains, but nothing seemed broken. He climbed to his feet and dusted himself off as much as he could, frustrated that he had not only lost his job, but had also ruined another shirt. Every time he tried to do the right thing, he always ended up getting hurt. Perhaps it was time to start thinking more about what was best for him. Everyone else seemed to get further than him by trampling on others. He stole a glance at the tavern to make sure no one else was after him, then headed home. His mind raced as he grappled against what had just happened. He had lost another job, and in this town, there were not many. His thoughts drifted to the letter in his house. Perhaps it was time. Bron's final words echoed in his head. Some keeper he would make, getting beaten up in a tavern. Yet, what else was there for them here? He walked at a quicker pace. To his relief, his knee did not hurt anymore, though now he was trying to ignore the pain from his ribs, a constant reminder of Bron's farewell gift. As he passed by a side street, someone called his name. It was not a voice that he recognized. Curious, he took a step back and peered down the dark street. Stepping out of the shadows was a dark-skinned man, clean-shaven, wearing fine white clothing. An ornate dagger hung from a belt on his waist. Next to him stood the two drunk men from the tavern. Edward wondered how they had gotten there before him. The man took a step closer before speaking. "Edward, I'm Jonathan. I'd like to have a word with you if I may." June ambled along the dusty streets of the foreign town, dragging her feet. A gentle breeze blew a strand of hair in front of her face, which she habitually tucked behind her ear. She peered around for any other places where she might find shelter, but saw none. Several other establishments had already turned her down. Perhaps this was a mistake. Had she been foolish to believe that her dream was from the Creator? Why would he send her anywhere? What did she know about the real world? She bit her lip in frustration. What would Gran say to her if she were there? June smiled at the idea. Her grandmother would probably tell her one of the stories of old, perhaps the one about the father of the faith, whom the Creator called to go to an unknown place. Perhaps she would tell her not to trust in her own abilities, but in the Creator's. Still, June could not seem to shake the reality of what was really going on. Fear of what lay ahead gripped her, plunging her into a well of hopelessness, drowning every thought as it tried to materialize. She peered at the side street just ahead of her. It looked somewhat secluded. It was getting dark, and she was running out of options. She could hide there for the night and continue south in the morning. As she turned down the narrow road, she began to reconsider her decision. The gloomy street was littered with damaged crates. High walls on either side spun a claustrophobic web all around her, closing her in on all sides to be swallowed up by the darkness. The steady dripping of water on a crate created an ominous rhythm. She thought about turning back but decided against it. There was nowhere else for her to spend the night. At least she could hide in the dark. It was not long before hushed voices teased her ears, which suddenly came to a stop. She paused and wondered whether she had actually heard them. Out of the shadows stepped three men. She peered from one to the other, taking a step back. Eerie shadows cast shapes on their faces. One of them moved forward. The snake-like glide of his step made her shiver. Though he was well dressed, it did not subtract from his threatening demeanor. He grinned at her. "It looks like you're lost, young lady. Perhaps we can be of some assistance." "I don't think she's lost," said another man, blowing his long hair out of his face. "I think she's come to the right place. We can take good care of her." His words seemed to slur together. He started laughing and then stretched out his hand on a wall to steady himself. He tried to move his hair out of his face, but seemed to decide against it when he almost fell over. "I remember her," said the third person, squinting in the shadows. His bald head stood in dark contrast to the man next to him. To June, he also seemed drunk, but not as much as the long-haired man. "Remember? From the tavern?" June's heart pounded hard as she thought of what these three men would do to her. Could she outrun them? She clenched her sweaty hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Creator, help me," she whispered, then turned around and ran. With impossible speed, the well-dressed man appeared right in front of her, wearing a sinister smile. He stopped abruptly. His eyes burrowed into hers. He grabbed her shoulder with one arm and squeezed, pulling her so close that she had to turn her head to avoid him. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed. She pushed him back, and he released his grip, laughing as if toying with her. It was then that she noticed his eyes, which for a brief instant glowed red. "Possessed," she muttered. He had to be. The man grinned. "So you know what I am," he whispered, so that only she could hear. "Wait!" a fourth voice interrupted. Out of the shadows stepped a familiar figure. "Let me. After all, you guys are the reason I got fired. You owe me." The demon-possessed man smiled in delight, obviously pleased with the outcome. The man stepped closer. June recognized him to be the young man from behind the bar at the tavern. He had not seemed cruel when she had met him. What did she know about people? "Her name is June. I met her earlier." He closed the distance, moving in like a hunter toward its prey. The two drunk men leaned back on the wall, huffing with disappointment. June's mind raced for a solution. She would fight. Somehow. Perhaps if she attacked first, she would have the advantage. How she hated violence. A muffled thud interrupted her thoughts as the man from the tavern struck the demon-possessed man hard on the side of the head. He fell to the ground right at her feet with a grunt. She glared at the young man, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Run!" he yelled, the sound of his voice echoing in the dark alleyway. June glanced between the two men, confused. Seizing the opportunity, she burst into a sprint, her savior running